This is a graphic dissection of a roadkill deer. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Actually, we'll just be dissecting half a deer. This doe was found shortly after being hit by a vehicle, and she was in rather bad shape with the lower half of her body severely mangled. I felt it was best to remove all but the torso before beginning, and we'll be dissecting just the chest or thoracic cavity. This deer also suffered extreme head trauma, and although sad, it's safe to say that this animal had a very quick death. This will be a rather hasty dissection. The animal was killed in summer, and that day our cold room at the college decided to quit working, so I knew she would get rather smelly rather quickly. We generally dissect preserved specimens in the lab. Preservation changes the look and texture of tissues quite a lot, but here we have an opportunity to see a fresh specimen. Note that the organs of this deer are roughly the size of an average human. This is what you look like on the inside. There are some tears in the diaphragm. The diaphragm is, of course, the large muscular structure that I'm pushing on here. If those tears were not present, I'd be able to force air in and out of the trachea and mouth of the deer. The dermis of the skin is attached to a very thin muscle that's used to twitch the skin if it's exposed to an irritant. You may have seen your dog, cat, or horse twitch if its skin is tickled or bit by a mosquito. We don't actually have this muscle. Under this thin muscle, you can see a much thicker layer of muscle known as the Latissimus Dorsi, a muscle that we do possess. Note that the muscles are attached to each other by a very loose, white, fibrous material known as areolar tissue. Areolar tissue is made up of collagen and elastin fibers, which are rather stretchy proteins that allow the muscles to slide past each other. It also allows the skin to slide past the overlying muscle. As you saw, I was able to break that layer fairly easily. Next, we'll take a look at that thicker muscle, the one I'm playing with right now, that underlies that thinner layer. This is, once again, the Latissimus Dorsi. The Latissimus Dorsi originates on the ribs, as you can see. I'm cutting away some of that connective tissue. And what this muscle does is it pulls the front limb backwards, or caudally, rotates the limb slightly, and pulls the limb closer to the midline of the body. Once again, we can see lots of connective tissue there that is attaching this muscle to the ribs. I'm going to go ahead and remove the skin now. That very, very thin muscle, as you'll note, is coming away with the skin. I mentioned we don't have that thin muscle. We don't have this muscle in our thorax, in our chest, to move our skin. We don't have that ability. This layer, though, is known as the Piniculus Carnosa, and we do have some derivatives of that. The very, very thin muscle of the neck, known as the platysma, that attaches directly to the skin, is a derivative of this layer, and some of the muscles that are involved in facial expression. So now I'm continuing to cut away fascia, and I'm sorry there's none of the original sound because it does make a rather satisfying, crisp noise, kind of like popping bubble wrap. Sorry. As we continue to cut away at the skin, we reveal the underlying musculature. Once again, we have the Latissimus dorsi here. We have the trapezius on top of that. And then we have this notable column of dense connective tissue known as the Thoracolumbar Fascia. We have some muscles of the neck, some of them that we don't have, things like the brachiocephalus. We have the leg here, of course, with the biceps and brachioradialis, and we also have the triceps on the back. That little bit that's poking out there is the elbow, the olecranon, as it's more properly known. Keep in mind that deer, as many quadrupeds do, walk on their toes. So that piece that I'm bending there is actually the wrist. Here we're seeing the underside of the dermis, very well vascularized, so we have lots of blood vessels supplying blood to the underside of the skin. And as we pan up, we can see those muscles again, the Latissimus dorsi and trapezius. What I'm pulling on here are nerves that would have led into the skin. These are actually the dorsal rami of consecutive spinal nerves. Now I'm going to pull back or reflect the Latissimus dorsi. The striations that you see on the latissimus and the trapezius, just above that, represent fascicles. Fascicles are bundles of muscle cells, and they indicate the direction in which the muscle will contract or shrink. You can see some very rough areas here. As I pull back the latissimus, these rough areas are where I've severed the Latissimus dorsi's attachments to the rib cage and also to the intercostal muscles. Between the ribs, we have the intercostal muscles. These will assist with heavy breathing. So we have the external intercostal muscles, and they help expand the rib cage during heavy breathing, and we have the internal intercostal muscles that do the opposite. They pull down on the rib cage and constrict the volume of the chest to help you force out air. Again, we've got kind of a rough area here, and that rough meaty area is where I detached the latissimus from the rib cage. Down the bottom, we have the cartilages, the costal cartilages that connect the ribs to the sternum. And that little flappy bit there, well, that's the xiphoid process. Okay, we're about ready to dive inside the chest, but before we do, let's remove the liver. Although the liver is naturally divided into lobes, there are several cracks and fissures in this liver that shouldn't be there. The liver is made up of rather soft reticular tissue, and this particular liver has been torn and damaged when the deer was hit by a vehicle. The liver is attached to the diaphragm by the coronary ligament, and we'll go ahead and cut through that. As we do, you'll probably notice quite a lot of congealed blood. We'll see more of that in a moment, just a warning. Although you might be tempted to think that there should be a gallbladder on the back of this liver, there isn't. There is no gallbladder in deer. Bile is stored in the gallbladder, and it's used to break down fat, and deer consume very little fat. Now I've taken some bone cutters and cut the costal cartilages where they connect to the sternum. Next, we'll cut the diaphragm. Keep in mind that this is a rather quick and dirty dissection. I'm not taking quite as much care as I would normally. The diaphragm is dome-shaped when relaxed. It originates from the interior circumference of the body wall and inserts into a central tendon. When it contracts, it flattens out, thereby increasing the volume of the chest cavity and causing the lungs to expand to fill this space. Now we've revealed the heart and lungs. Note how shiny the lining of the body wall and the exterior of the lungs are. This shiny membrane secretes a lubricating fluid known as serous fluid that prevents the lungs from sticking to the thoracic wall. Although you might not think it, vertebrates are segmented animals. Unlike an earthworm, though, our segmentation is internal and not visible on the surface. You can see this very clearly here. Each vertebra has 2 ribs attached to it, and each rib has its own associated artery, vein, and nerve, and this pattern is repeated over and over. I've taken the bone cutters again, and this time I've clipped the ribs where they attach to the vertebrae, so that we can fold the ribs out of the way and get a clearer look at the contents of the thoracic cavity. The cavity contains a great deal of congealed blood. As you can see here, the inferior vena cava was broken during the collision, and this caused blood to pool within the cavity. The blood has the consistency of jello, and I have to admit, it's kind of fun to play with. While I'm playing with this, and probably telling a story I shouldn't, let me just briefly apologize for the fact that my voiceover doesn't always match what you're seeing on screen, but hopefully you can figure that out. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to play with this stuff. But playtime is over. Along the bottom here, you can see where the diaphragm was attached to the body wall. You can also see the continuation of the serous membrane that lines the entirety of the pleural cavities that contain the lungs. I've got a piece of the diaphragm here, and I'm tugging on it quite hard. In fact, pretty much as hard as I can. It's not breaking. This is a very tough muscular structure that, of course, performs a very essential role. Have a look at the lungs here. We can see they're very pink. This deer was obviously a non-smoker. And next, let's take a look at the heart. The heart is surrounded by a serous membrane known as the pericardium. The pericardium forms the pericardial sac, and it separates the heart from the other contents of the thoracic cavity. It's lubricated, it's expandable, it allows the heart to move freely as it beats. We'll cut that open and take a better look at the heart. There's a point at the bottom of the heart. This is the apex of the heart, and it flicks around quite a bit as the heart beats. As I turn the heart over, you can see a groove known as the anterior interventricular sulcus. It contains blood vessels that nourish the muscles of the heart, and it marks the location of the interventricular septum. The pericardium is a very tough membrane, as my little tug of war here demonstrates. It has to be quite tough because the heart does move around quite a lot within the chest. I'm going to cut that away just to tidy up the chest cavity a little bit. I've done some more tidying, this time to reveal the trachea. So up here, the white rings that you can see are cartilages that support the trachea or windpipe. They wouldn't normally be visible like this. I've removed quite a bit of connective tissue and some muscle so that we can get a better look. But you can see that the windpipe does not collapse as I push on it because those cartilages help support it. The large dark blood vessel here is the cranial vena cava, which collects blood from the jugulars and other veins, such as the pectoral branches, which you can also see. Note that this large blood vessel would be called the superior vena cava in us, but then we don't walk on all fours. The small red blood vessel running alongside is the carotid artery, and what I'm touching right now is the thymus gland. The thymus gland produces T cells in young animals. In older animals, it generally atrophies, it disintegrates. We'll take a very quick look at the heart before we move on. What you're seeing at the top here is the auricle of the left atrium. And below that, we've got the left ventricle that forcefully pumps blood out to the systemic loop of the body. We'll come back to the heart in more detail. I've exposed a tube here that runs along the back of the thoracic cavity, and this is the esophagus. It runs in a groove between the two lungs. Compare it to the trachea that I'm poking right now. The trachea does not collapse when I poke it because of those cartilage rings, but the esophagus is pretty much always collapsed. It's referred to as a potential tube. Food is pushed along the esophagus by waves of muscle contractions known as peristalsis. Next, I'll be showing you a deeper dissection of the shoulder. I've done the dissection, I've reassembled all the bits and pieces so we can get our bearings. I'll lift away the right forelimb, and the cavity that's exposed behind the musculature of the scapula is natural. The scapula or shoulder blade is loosely held in place, which allows for a great deal of movement, although not as much movement as we'd see in humans like ourselves. Next, I'm going to take away the right side of the rib cage, and notice the attachment of the diaphragm and the shiny, lubricating lining of the body wall. Now I'll move the lungs out of the way so we can have another quick look at the heart in situ. As I turn the heart over, you can see a large blood vessel, and this is the pulmonary trunk. It carries deoxygenated blood away from the heart to the right and left lungs. The dark structures on either side are the atria. We have the left atrium on the right-hand side of your screen and the right atrium on the left-hand side of your screen. I've taken some time to clear away a whole bunch of tissue so that we can follow the trachea and the esophagus up into the neck. In the neck, you can clearly see a very dark vein, and that's the jugular vein. And also, alongside that, we can see a carotid artery. I've cleaned up the trachea so that you can see those rings, although technically they're not rings. They're actually C-shaped pieces of cartilage, so they're not joined at the back, and the esophagus fits into a groove at the back. It would normally be held in there by connective tissue, but I've dissected that connective tissue away and pulled the esophagus away so you can see it as a separate element, but it would slot into that tube. The groove is spanned by connective tissue and smooth muscle that can contract to narrow the trachea a little bit. If you swallow food, that food travels down the esophagus as a bolus. And as it moves down the esophagus expands, and it actually expands slightly into that groove, into the back of the trachea. The paths taken by food and air diverge within the larynx, which is a structure that's also supported by cartilage. You can see the larynx here. The larynx is supported in the neck by a series of bones that connect it to the skull. These bones form what's known as the hyoid apparatus. In humans, they all fuse together to form one bone, but that's not the case in the deer. You can even see some of the small muscles here that move the larynx. I've completely removed the larynx now, and we're seeing the top of the larynx as it would appear if you made a deer say ah and looked deep into its throat. Those two little nubs on either side are the cut ends of the lower horns of the hyoid apparatus. The large flap is the epiglottis. You can see dots on the epiglottis, and those are actually taste buds. Interestingly, taste buds are not just restricted to the tongue. The large opening is the glottis. This is the opening into the trachea, and peering down into this hole, we can see two small folds. Those are the vocal folds or vocal cords. When you swallow food, the epiglottis folds down over the glottis. And what this does is it prevents food from entering into the trachea. So it folds over, and then the food is redirected into the esophagus. Recall that the esophagus is a muscular collapsed tube that will move the food down to the stomach. If you were raised on a farm, or perhaps you're a butcher or hunter, you might refer to what I'm holding here as the pluck of the deer. In this case, the pluck consists of the larynx, trachea, esophagus, heart, and lungs. The larynx is, of course, at the top, and then we have the trachea and esophagus below that. We're looking at the dorsal aspect of this structure, and what I'm pulling on right there is the esophagus. It continues between that dorsal groove between the two lungs. Turning this around, we're now looking at the ventral aspect of these structures. We have the heart with the atria on top, and we have along the middle here this atrioventricular sulcus that marks the division between the two ventricles. Up above that, we have the thymus, and then between the thymus and the heart, we have the pulmonary trunk. Okay, let's get this plucky little guy up on the table here and have a closer look. We'll start by removing a rather large blood clot from what's left of the inferior or caudal vena cava. Next, I'll remove the heart. This is how the heart would sit within the body cavity. We're seeing it from a ventral view. Now, if I were to do a detailed dissection of the heart, I would take a bit more care and cut the blood vessels further away from the heart in order to better trace their connections. However, I want to make sure not to nick the lungs because I'd like to try and inflate them. Stay tuned, it's going to be awesome. I must confess, I did do a little bit of damage to the heart. Whoops. So there's the heart, and as you might have heard before, your heart is roughly the size of your fist. Although this is a different species, it would appear that this is pretty much what my heart looks like. It's time for inflation. So what I've done here is I've taken a hose connected to a foot pump, inserted that through the glottis into the trachea, and secured it with an elastic band. As I pump on the foot pump, I'm expanding the alveoli within the lungs. Right now we're seeing the lungs from a dorsal perspective, and as I rotate it, we're seeing it from a ventral perspective, so from the chest. There's a large notch there, that's the cardiac notch. That space would be occupied by the heart. Finally, let's take a more detailed look at the heart, beginning with the ventral surface. We'll start with the anterior interventricular artery, the circumflex artery, and the marginal artery. Turning the heart a bit, we can see the pulmonary trunk, and right next to it we have the aortic arch. I'm sticking the probe into that now, and you can see it's a very thick-walled artery. As I rotate the heart upright, we can see the brachiocephalic trunk. Here we have the left and right atria, and as we turn the heart over, once again we've got the aortic arch, and we've got the pulmonary trunk. I'm going to take the probe here, and I'm going to stick it into the left and right pulmonary arteries that branch off of that trunk. Now, this hole shouldn't be here. I goofed and I cut a bit too close. I actually cut into the left atrium. Notice how thin-walled it is. This is the auricle of the left atrium. Auricle means ear, and it does kind of look like a floppy elephant ear. I'm now going to take the probe and I'm going to insert it into the inferior or caudal vena cava, up through the right atrium, and out through the superior or cranial vena cava. Note how thin-walled those vessels are. Here we have the auricle, again the external little floppy bit of the right atrium. And here we have the posterior atrioventricular sulcus on the back of the heart. Finally, let's cut this baby open. This is a ventral view with the left side of the heart here and the right side over here. I've decided to do something a little bit different. I'm going to cut a plane of section through the aortic arch. So I'm going to cut right along this plane and divide the heart into two pieces. Now that I've made my cut, let's split the heart in twain and have a look inside. So we've got quite a lot of congealed blood there once again, and we'll pull the blood out of the right ventricle. Notice that it's very thin-walled. This is the ventricle that pushes blood out to the nearby lungs. And then we'll follow that up by cleaning out the left ventricle. Now that things are nice and tidy, let's take a closer look. The heart is, of course, a very muscular organ. At the top is the aorta, and the very large opening there is the brachiocephalic. That will carry blood to the front limb, neck, and head. Below this, we have the opening into the coronary artery. It's going to carry blood to the superficial musculature of the heart. You can see the cusps of the aortic valve here. The aortic valve prevents blood from flowing in the wrong direction. It ensures that blood leaves the left ventricle and goes into the aorta and doesn't backflow. This is the left ventricle, and within the left ventricle, we can see the cusps of the left atrioventricular valve, also known as the bicuspid or mitral valve. The cusps are attached to string-like structures known as the chordae tendineae, and these are attached to little bumps, papillae, at their base. Within the base, we have the papillary muscles that pull on these cords, pull on that valve, and prevent it from opening when the left ventricle contracts. I'm now inserting a probe into the left atrium. Those little cavities lead into the left auricle. Note that the left ventricle of the heart is comprised of a very, very thick layer of muscle. The myocardium is very thick because it must push blood through the entire systemic loop of the body. Compare that to the right ventricle. It has a much thinner wall of muscle as it only needs to push blood a very short distance. It pushes blood to the lungs, which of course are directly adjacent. In the right ventricle, we can see the chordae of the right atrioventricular, or tricuspid valve. Passing the probe up further shows the entrance into the right atrium and the auricle of the right atrium. Although it is definitely more obvious on the other side of the heart, this area here is the interior of the left ventricle. We have one of the cusps of the aortic valve here, and the other half of the aortic arch. After having taken a quick tug at the heartstrings, let's take a quick look at the flow of blood through the heart. Keep in mind that the plane of section I'm using is slightly different from what you might have seen in a textbook. To get our bearings, recall that this is the aorta up the top here, and notice that I've used straws to mark the route of blood a bit clearer. Let's start on the left-hand side of the heart. The left ventricle is going to receive blood from the left atrium. As the left ventricle contracts, the left atrioventricular valve is held closed. This means that blood will be forced through the aortic valve and up into the aortic arch. Again, the first branch of the aorta will carry blood to the surface of the heart, whereas the second opening will carry blood to the head and to the right arm. In mammals, the left side of the heart carries only oxygenated blood, while the right side carries only deoxygenated blood, and the two do not mix. Let's pull the auricle of the right atrium aside so that we can see the pathway taken by blood that's returning from the body tissues. We can see a straw that's entering through the cranial vena cava. There would be blood coming up from the inferior vena cava as well, or caudal vena cava. But this blood is going to pass through the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then blood traveling this route will pass through the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary trunk, into the right and left pulmonary arteries on its way to be oxygenated at the lungs. Well, that wraps up our quick little dissection of the deer. I hope you found it entertaining and educational. Note that this is not the end of the deer. The story does continue. Click on that link to see what happened next. And please consider subscribing if you'd like to see more videos like this.